first we're going to discuss some drama going down at CBS News, which obviously is in the headlines because Bari Weiss, who's perceived as more right-leaning, though she's in some ways more classically liberal, has taken over there and is overhauling it. Well, they're involved in some serious drama because one of their editors or correspondents there has pushed back after trans activists who kind of masquerade as journalist authorities and experts on journalism put out a guide saying essentially that acknowledging biology is offensive. And one of the editors at CBS, who I guess feels emboldened by Bari Weiss, was like, no, we're not playing these stupid games anymore. So let's go to the New York Post's reporting on this story. CBS News staff clashed over transgender language in internal email blowup report. A CBS News correspondent sparked an internal clash after circulating a staff-wide email urging colleagues to avoid language recommended by a trans journalist group when writing about transgender people. According to reports, the dispute erupted on November 6th, though we're just learning about it now through the new reporting, when staffers received an email from a prominent correspondent saying the network should, quote, refrain from adopting terminology advocated by the Trans Journalists Association. The message took aim at guidance from the Trans Journalists Association stylebook, which advises reporters and editors on how to, quote, improve news coverage of trans people and the stories that affect them. Now, you might be wondering why you would want to push back. Like, wouldn't you just want to use inclusive language and all that? Well, when you actually see what these activists suggest that journalists should do, it makes more sense why a serious journalist like this correspondent, who was identified, and we'll get to that identification, would be like, yeah, we're not playing those stupid games. Anyway, more here. A CBS producer fired back in a reply-all message viewed by The Guardian, writing, it's a TGA-style guide, that's what I'm trying to do, guide us to better coverage. A reporter for news site Semaphore later reported that the correspondent who sent the original email was Jan Crawford, CBS News' national and legal correspondent. CBS News editor and chief Bari Weiss said the exchanges were nothing out of the ordinary. So, of course, she said that they want to speak plainly and they do not want to treat biological sex as, quote, as if it's an alien dialect or an obscure technicality. Now, why would she say this? Because when you look at what those trans journalists were pushing, that's what they suggested, that the idea of acknowledging biology is essentially offensive or erases trans identity or is problematic. And actually, people staffing mainstream newsrooms still buy into this. They're still stuck mentally in 2014 or 2019 or a time when people were not awake to this insanity and foolishness. So here's from the Post, the controversial bit of this that Jan Crawford took a stand against, and shout out to her for that. The Trans Journalists Association Style Guide lays out a set of, quote, editorial best practices, urging journalists to, quote, center transgender people in stories about their lives and to rely on self-identification for names, pronouns, and gender. So I will say on this one, I have a little bit of internal conflict about what you should do as a neutral journalist if you are just a reporter or a correspondent when it comes to using names and pronouns. Names I actually think is simple because if someone has legally changed their name, you should use their new name because it's legally changed. It's not really even taking a side. It's just acknowledging a reality. But when it comes to things like pronouns, I think there has to be a limit. I think obviously you're going to lose credibility and seriousness as a news institution if you are using Z, Zer, Zem pronouns for someone. At the same time, if you don't use preferred pronouns, you're kind of like, so say that you're writing a story about Caitlyn Jenner and you he, him, the whole story, you're sort of taking a side in this intense cultural debate, but you're also taking a side if you use the pronouns, in my view. So it's actually hard for me to figure out exactly what the right answer is for a neutral journalist. For an opinion commentator or political commentator like myself, we can just do what we think is right, what we agree with. But if you are actually trying to maintain objectivity and neutrality, that'd be a tricky one. I would probably recommend that you just avoid pronouns, as clunky as that would result in your copy. I think that's probably the best solution, to just be like, so-and-so, use their name instead of a pronoun, even though it would result in clunky copy, because then you could kind of avoid coming down on one side, what else can you do to try to be objective and neutral? I kind of don't know. That is a tricky one, but I don't think you can just defer to whatever the trans people say, because that's not objective. That's not neutral. That's, in some cases, means you would be sounding ridiculous and embracing insanity. But here's the craziest part of what these trans journalists were pushing. Not only do they tell people to respect self-ID and all this stuff, but they also define biology as offensive. We're going to get into the details here, but first, guys, do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Do hit the like button while you're at it. And please, if you're watching here with us on YouTube, do consider becoming a channel member. It's just $3.99 a month, though there are other tiers you can support if you want to do even more to support the show, but it is the best way to help my content stay independent so I can criticize the left and the right, and I do not have to pander to the partisan YouTube algorithm. So please, link in the description or hit the join button to become a channel member if you can help support me today. Now back to the Post's story about this. This is really crazy. The Trans Journalists Association also flags terms such as, quote, biological sex, quote, biological men, and, quote, biological women as especially fraught outside medical contexts, recommending alternatives like, quote, assigned sex at birth, and cautioning that some language has become politicized. The Trans Journalists Association is telling us that language has become politicized. Sir, ma'am, they, them, the mirror is mirroring. Look in it, okay? Anyway, quote, this guide is meant to provide a foundation for covering trans people with accuracy and nuance, and it addresses many common language and reporting difficulties, the style book says, but it is by no means comprehensive. The English lexicon of gender, sex, and sexuality is dynamic and constantly contested. So we should unpack this story a little bit, because I think it's a microcosm of a couple things. And one of them represents an LGBT theme and another one is a media theme. So on the LGBT theme, this is why y'all lost. This is why trans acceptance is plummeting, why there's a massive backlash against trans people, which, while I support some of the issues like, preserving fairness of women's sports and stopping kids from making irreversible medical transitions, I have no hate in my heart for trans people. I have no problem with trans adults with gender dysphoria living however will make them happiest, and I don't want them discriminated against or bullied in any kind of malicious way. So I'm not happy to see the backlash we're living through against trans people more broadly, especially culturally. Some of it just feels mean and nasty and close-minded, but this is how we got here, by the trans and gender activists denying biology and denying reality. They weren't just asking for like live and let live, freedom to let us as adults live differently and do our own thing, and we won't bother you and you don't bother us. Americans are mostly chill with that. Americans would really have no issue with that. But it's this kind of insanity, like labeling biological sex a fraught term when it's just a reality, and then denying and gaslighting. I mean, the Equality Act that these groups push in Congress literally would allow them to, it would have redefined sex under federal law to mean whatever you feel like, self-ID, gender identity, which is just not true, right? Initially, and it's so funny, I remember this was like the woke take a decade and a half ago. Sex and gender are different. Yeah, your sex is biology and can't be changed, but you can have a different gender identity. At some point, that I think some people were willing to entertain that, but at some point they just threw it out and were like, yeah, sex is fake. It's not real. Biology is offensive. That is a position that only the craziest 15% of society on the left was ever going to accept. So you have isolated yourself from reality and sanity and normalcy by doubling down on that, and then you have sabotaged your movement. The other interesting aspect of this story is that it's kind of a microcosm of a broader problem in mainstream media. Why is mainstream media so biased in so many ways towards the left or towards kind of the center left, especially on social issues and things like that? Well, one of it is like newsroom bias, and it's not some grand conspiracy. It's not like they all huddle and like, how can we make the news liberal today? It's just that the people running the newsrooms are overwhelmingly liberal, overwhelmingly Democrats, overwhelmingly come from a certain slice of the American population. And so, of course, there's going to be bias that creeps in. And then two, They have over the years outsourced a lot of their journalistic decisions to activist groups like the Trans Journalists Association. For years, that was just normal. Oh, what are we going to say about this? Let's ask the NAACP. How are we going to talk about this issue? Let's ask the trans groups. It's like they outsourced as if these were neutral experts, but they're not. They're obviously highly ideological institutions. And so to bend the knee to these activists was always journalistic malpractice, but now we're seeing it called out and spotlighted now that Barry Weiss has taken over CBS News, and I think there's a new lease on life there. And you have some people like Jan Crawford, who is a legal correspondent who's talked about the Supreme Court, and I don't get the sense that she's a conservative Republican, but she has pushed back on a lot of false left-wing narratives about the High Court and other things, and I get the sense that she's somebody who's honest and serious, and that's why she's pushing back on this. But especially now that we have someone else in charge, or we have this new lease on life at CBS, I would expect more stories like this to come out that kind of show what's under the hood in the media world. And we're going to see more and more surprise and kind of insanity like this come out as it does. And more surprising stories will be leaked and reported out, I suspect. But what do you guys think? Do you agree that biology is offensive? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to subscribe, like, become a channel member if you can to support my work and all of that. Now, while we're talking about the media and trans activism gone awry, there's another story I want to highlight. And the reason I want to highlight this is because even a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for such an article to be published in mainstream media and widely circulated and discussed online, because it would have been considered so problematic and so offensive. But one of the most insane aspects of gender activism has been placing males, biological males, in women's prisons. And it's something that's been enacted and put into policy in blue states like California and Massachusetts. And even sex offenders, even male sex offenders who just say they're women, were placed under this radical gender self-ID policy, were placed in women's prisons. And many women were harmed as a result. And now, after all these years, it's finally become okay for people to speak out against it, and mainstream media outlets will acknowledge it, which is why The Hill just published a fascinating article by a young woman named Forrest Rome, who called this out in her article titled "Inside the Women's Prison, Where Violent Male Inmates Have Their Way," because she's been investigating this subject. She writes, "A civilized society protects women and children from men who seek to harm them. Yet under the banner of progress, child RAPISTSs, serial sex offenders, and wife killers can now secure access to one of our most vulnerable populations, female prisoners, by uttering 5 magic words. I identify as a woman. This is not hyperbole," she writes. Under Massachusetts' 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act, male offenders convicted of exactly the crimes named above are being housed at MCI Framingham, the state's women's prison. That's right, guys. Under these blue state policies, not only did they allow biologically male people, trans women, or just in many cases, not even what you would actually consider a trans woman, somebody who has had gender dysphoria forever and lived as if they're a woman, but just people who suddenly decide they are just allowed to go into women's prisons. What could possibly go wrong? How could that possibly endanger the safety of women? How did any sane person ever think that was anything other than unhinged? But as she reports on, the consequences were very severe in terms of the safety of women of these policies. So she writes, "Female inmates there, who I've interviewed extensively as part of my research on the impact of gender ideology in custodial settings, described the facility as a, quote, haven for sexual predators who pretend to be transgender. They all requested anonymity, fearing retaliation, both from the prison administration and the trans-identified inmates, many of whom they describe as both volatile and threatening." She writes further in this article, "As a mental health professional with expertise in sexual trauma, I'm acutely aware that nearly all incarcerated women are survivors of male violence. The presence of men in their housing units is therefore destabilizing and arguably amounts to cruel and unusual punishment." She then goes through a long list of supposed trans women who are being held in this prison, multiple of them, who include, their crimes include sexually assaulting and murdering women, raping a 14-year-old at gunpoint, let's see. Oh, decapitating his wife. Oh my gosh, I can't even read some of these crimes. They are so horrific. That is the level of serious criminality that we're talking about, of violent, sick, deranged behavior. And yet they're opening the door and saying, here, go in the women's prison, if that's how you identify. What? Even if you were going to have a policy that allowed trans women to go into women's prisons as a rule, you would think, in a sane world, I think there should be probably a separate ward in men's prisons for trans women. And you should have, because the other side of this coin is that trans women would not be safe in general men's population prisons, and their safety and dignity matters too. Of course it does. But you can't endanger women. And obviously this endangers women. And many of these women have claimed to have been assaulted by these men, both sexually and physically. And would that surprise anyone if that was true? Obviously, just an allegation, but not exactly far-fetched to see how that could happen. But anyway, back to the point I was making. In any world with a semblance of sanity, laws allowing trans women in women's prisons would at least have an exception for like murder, for like sexual assault of women or children. But they don't in some of these states. And this is the default position of the Democratic Party and the ACLU, the trans activist organizations, Gavin Newsom, these other figures supported this over the years. How did that ever happen? How did we ever get here? It's just truly remarkable. But it's also remarkable that this kind of thing can now be openly aired in mainstream media, because it was going on years ago, but people didn't have the courage to publish stories about it or talk about it. Shout out to this young woman, Forrest Rom, or Rom, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Romm, but this article is really insightful. The research she's doing is really important, and more here. She writes that many of the males that have been sent to MCI Framingham since 2018 discontinued cross-sex hormone treatment after arrival. And the female inmates that she interviewed said that nearly all of them retain intact male genitalia. So they don't even have to actually pretend to be trans. They can just claim it, start it, and then go off it, and then just run loose as a dude in prison. You can't make this shit up. It sounds like a Babylon Bee article, but it is the default policy of gender activists in blue states. Anyway, more here. Gatekeeping is almost non-existent. In Massachusetts, men may be placed in women's facilities without even a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. This is a feature, not a failure, of enforcement. Under the Commonwealth's self-identification framework promoted by transgender activists, one becomes a woman by simply claiming to be one. That is crazy. And I don't understand how the Democratic Party ever thinks normal, everyday women who aren't right-wing, ultra-conservatives are ever going to accept that idea. Or that that's a good way to, because there is and always has been a tiny slice of society that truly suffers from persistent gender dysphoria. Who the hell ever thought that lumping them in with this was a good way to secure dignity and acceptance for them and tolerance? Whoever that person is, whoever all these people are who have been pushing this, they belong in a padded room, honestly. So more from her article here. Female inmates describe being harassed and abused by these men, but fear institutional reprisal if they report it. Most women I interviewed said prison officials routinely minimize sexual assault allegations against trans-identified males, or inmates who are male, while female accusers are dismissed, discredited, or punished. Some alleged victims gave me detailed written statements supporting their accounts. Oh my goodness. One woman incarcerated at MCI Framingham told me she was raped by a male prisoner in November and that authorities responded to her complaint by placing her in restrictive housing. She's now confined to a locked cell and permitted to leave only once per day briefly to shower. It feels like I'm being punished for speaking up, she said. They're treating me as if I should have kept my mouth shut, as if it's my fault, or as though I should have defended myself. Oh my goodness. What? This is heartbreaking stuff. And this is happening at the behest of activists who in one breath push this shit and in the other breath probably claim to be feminists. It's genuinely disturbing and beyond parody in many ways. Now, just a couple more points here, because I can't even dwell on this subject. It's so disturbing. Somebody has to confront Democrats on this. Like Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, who's a lesbian feminist. Do you support this? You're down for this? Gavin Newsom, who's a proud feminist and ally to women. You're cool with this. Really? Anyway, more from the story here. In the Hill, as troubling as the situation at Framingham is, it is not unique. Across the country, male inmates are being housed with women based on self-declared gender identity, a circular, unfalsifiable concept that relies solely on the inmate's own word. More than 51% of these men are serving sentences for sexual crimes. Illinois, California, New York, Washington, and New Jersey have each already documented alleged rapes resulting from the forced cohabitation of female prisoners with males identifying as transgender. Wow. We talk about policies where it is, people say, oh, there's blood on their hands for these policies. And I don't fully buy into that framework. I think ultimately the criminal who commits the act is the one that bears the responsibility for the evil that they've done. But you can certainly say that these insane policies made this happen, made this possible. Still, ultimately, the sick men who perpetrated these crimes, alleged crimes, are responsible, but the policymakers should be held accountable for enabling it. And maybe they had good intentions, but it doesn't matter when you put women in danger. If you had good intentions, that's still a grotesque failure of your basic responsibilities as a policymaker. And there's just absolutely no room for nuance or for any compromise with some of these people. So just one final point from this article. Early last year, California State Senator Shannon Grove, a Republican, introduced a bill to make her state's women's prisons establish separate units for trans-identified inmates, limited to sleeping quarters and other intimate spaces. Meals, recreation, work, and other general programming would have continued alongside the female population. But Democrats rejected this compromise as discriminatory, even after it was further narrowed to apply only to sex offenders. Oh my gosh. I'm rarely left speechless or with no words from a story, but I guess I can't say I'm that surprised given how insane our politics are in every direction. But the idea that Democratic state lawmakers in California rejected separating male prisoners in women's prisons where they really shouldn't be at all, even when it was narrowed to just sex offenders. They don't care about women's safety. They are literally prioritizing the feelings and preferences of male violent criminals who claim to be trans, but aren't really, many of them most likely, even in the sense of having actual gender dysphoria, over the safety and dignity of many, 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 many more women. It's beyond parody. It is insane beyond words. But honestly, the Democrats are going to have to reckon with this at some point. And until they do, we need to spotlight it because it is one of many things holding back the Democratic Party from offering a sane and normal alternative to Trump. That's my take on it all. Shout out to Forrest for her reporting. You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe, like, and all of that.